It would be incredibly simplistic to start this video with something trite, like the 1990s pushed the limits of video game controversies. I mean, they did, yeah, but every decade pushes the limits of the previous one. However, it was in the 90s that the rate of change truly started accelerating. We're going to spend some time today talking about the 7 most controversial games of the 90s. One thing to keep in mind, controversial doesn't always mean violence or gore. Yes, there's a lot of that, but this was the 90s when violence was, dare I say it, a little more commonplace. That means that some games were controversial for other reasons, including fears of addictive gameplay, use by mass murderers, or, of course, Satanism. And speaking of Satanism, let's start with Doom. The game, developed on the Doom engine by id Software, became something of a legend within the video game world. It helped to influence some of the most important gaming trends of the 90s, the rise of first-person shooters, networks play, and a robust community of creators that would create mods and maps. In Doom, you play as Doom Guy, the nameless character whose job is basically to kill hell after a science experiment gone wrong. The first game came out in 1993 and came out in 3 episodes that were available via a shareware model, an early version of freemium in which players could download a free version of the game before purchasing a full one. The game was a massive hit, selling 3.5 million copies. It was such a success that it spawned a near immediate sequel, Doom 2, which sold over 2 million copies. Doom makes this list for 2 reasons. First is obvious. The game is violent, adding a level of blood and guts that hadn't really been seen in previous games. Enemies explode upon getting hit with certain weapons, and there is an awful lot of blood, guts, and viscera. The Sega 32X version of the game earned a mature 17+ rating, and the game's sales were severely censored in certain countries like Germany. However, being the legendary series that it is, Doom branched out and was known for far more than its violence. It was also dinged by some advocates for its ties to Satanism. The game was thought by some to be replete with ties to hell, Satan, and demons, with imagery in the game being thought to be inspired by hell. Unfortunately, Doom found itself back on the news in the late 1990s for all the wrong reasons. In the aftermath of the Columbine school shooting that killed 13 and injured 20, it was determined that one of the shooters was an avid Doom player who created his own levels and said that committing the massacre would be, quote, like playing Doom, end quote. There were even rumors, thankfully proven false, that the shooter had actually created a level which mimicked his school and the people in it. Speaking of games that had their supposed violence exaggerated, let's talk about Night Trap. I'd actually argue that Night Trap is one of the more technologically revolutionary games on this list, even though its gameplay was kinda meh. Night Trap was a 1992 interactive movie that featured full motion video, or FMV. This, in and of itself, was somewhat revolutionary. The game took advantage of the graphics and hardware capabilities of the Sega CD. It also did something very rare for the time, in that it hired relatively well-known actors, including child and teenage acting star Dana Plato. The plot, and I use that term loosely, is that you are a member of the Sega Control Attack Team, or SCAT. Ugh. A group of teenage girls is vacationing at the estate of vampires. Why? Don't pay attention. Your job is to watch the girls on security cameras and activate the traps that are meant to kill vampires who control the estate and are attempting to turn the young women. The plot of the game evolves based on your actions and which of the teenage girls you are able to save. So, why did Night Trap get such a controversial reception? Honestly, it was kind of stupid. The FMV nature of the game meant that any supposed infraction was going to look more quote-unquote realistic and garner extra attention. In particular, opponents of the game noted that some scenes, like the nightgown scene in which Lisa is captured in her nightgown, implied violence and sexual violence against women. That wasn't the case at all, but that made no difference to some. Those some included members of Congress, and specifically Senator Joe Lieberman, who used games like Night Trap to argue for additional controls and censorship over the video game industry. Ironically, the controversy existed here in spite of the fact that there is no blood, marginal violence, and absolutely no nudity in the game. Indeed, according to Bill White, Vice President of Marketing for Sega, the game was meant more as a parody of vampire melodramas than anything else. By today's standards, you'd practically see some of this stuff in a kid's cartoon. The controversy surrounding Night Trap and Mortal Kombat, yes, we will get there shortly, had some significant impacts in the short term and the long term for the video game industry. In the week following the congressional hearings, 50,000 copies of the game were sold, a massive number in what we can only call the video game version of the Streisand effect. However, in the long term, the game was pulled from Toys R Us and KB Toys, largely as a result of consumer complaints that may have been part of an organized telephone campaign against the game. Largely as a result of the controversy surrounding violent games like Night Trap, video game companies developed the ESRB, or Entertainment Software Ratings Board, which rated games. Yes, those ratings came directly as a result of video game controversies in the 90s. I hope you enjoy these videos, and if you do, please hit that subscribe button. We do regular video game content on the best games of the 80s and 90s, and if you want to see more, please subscribe now. The 1990s were filled with racing games that interspersed violence, cars, and combat. I'm talking about games like Interstate 76 and Jump Raven. One of the most controversial of this genre was Carmageddon. Carmageddon is a racing game. Sort of. You race around in various settings, but the real goal of the game is to run everything over. That includes cars, animals, or people. The game did something that was somewhat rare at the time, in that it created a relatively realistic physics engine and a destructible environment, with items crumpling as you drove over them. In the words of lead programmer Patrick Buckland, the game, quote, came from playing racing games for years and getting fed up with racing, end quote, and was meant for players who just wanted to crash into things. What I'm going to say next will inevitably shock you. The game used controversy to sell copies. At first, developers added the concept of running over pedestrians, hoping that this alone would generate controversy, create buzz, and sell more copies. The problem? Games were already coming out that used such tactics, including Quarantine and the Die Hard trilogy. So, developers started to give extra points for killing innocent civilians, hoping that this would generate even more controversy. In this regard, Carmageddon actually bears a similarity to the very first violent video game, 1975's Death Race, in which you run over zombies. I actually did a video on Death Race some time ago, link in the description. There's an additional connection between Death Race and Carmageddon. Both games use zombies, but Carmageddon only used zombies when the country's video game ratings board made them in order to censor violence of the game. That happened in places like Germany and the United Kingdom, and the game was completely banned in some countries like Brazil. If the plan was to use controversy to sell more copies of the game, it worked. Carmageddon won the Game of the Year trophy from the 1997 PC Zone Reader Awards, as well as the Driving Game of the Year in 1997 from the same magazine. One estimate held that the game sold over 118,000 copies by 2002. An expansion pack, the Splat Pack, was released a year later, and ports of the game were available on the iOS and Android systems in the early 2010s. Carmageddon was nice and all, but it had nothing on the real car violence game, Grand Theft Auto. We all know what the GTA series is, and I'm sure you, like me, are eagerly awaiting GTA 6. The channel might go a little dark when the game finally premieres. However, the series has come a long way from its rather humble origins. In fact, in its original incarnation, it wasn't even supposed to be the game we know and love today. Grand Theft Auto started its life as a game called Race and Chase. In that game, you play in one of 4 modes that was, according to game developers, essentially a computer version of Cops and Robbers. Like the GTA series that ultimately came out, the game promised mayhem and allowed players to play from a top-down perspective. However, the game was linear and boring. The series was ultimately saved by a bug. According to developers, during playtesting, police in the game abruptly started acting, quote, mental and aggressive, end quote, attempting to run you off the road rather than merely pull you over. This resulted in a brand new and much more fun game, inspiring the version of GTA we know and love today. I actually did a video on this topic some time ago, link in the description, and please know it was one of my first videos, so be kind. The game was released in 1997 and almost immediately hit a slew of controversy. The nature of the game was bad enough, with, the required shooting and pedestrian violence. However, it wasn't just the graphics that led to controversy, but the antisocial violence of the game. Remember, this was one of the first major games that required you to kill police officers and evade the law. That resulted in widespread condemnation, higher ratings in countries throughout the world, and straight up bans in some countries like Brazil. Of course, that controversy was very intentional. Publicist Max Clifford intentionally planted stories as part of an effort to generate controversy for the game. That worked. The game sold more than 6 million units, generated 2 expansions, and resulted in the series that we love today. Next, EverQuest. No, seriously, EverQuest. EverQuest was, more or less, the first majorly successful MMO. It premiered in March 1999 and took off like a rocket, taking advantage of the new technology and internet connectivity that allowed players to enjoy MMOs. While the game has since backed far off its initial highs, it remains massively impactful in the computer gaming world. At its peak, subscribers reached around 550,000, and between 2003 and 2004, it had around 275,000 daily players. The game allows players to create their own character, complete missions, raid dungeons, all that good stuff. And therein lay the problem. The game contained nearly endless opportunities for exploration, leveling up, and world immersion, and this proved to be too much for some players who began to immerse themselves in the world of EverQuest at the expense of the real world. There's no doubt that some of the issues of EverQuest were exaggerated, but many real-world tragedies did occur. One player, Sean Woolley, died by suicide after an online betrayal, leading his mother to form Gamers Anonymous and raise awareness about the broader societal problem of addictive gaming. 2001 also saw Tony Lamont Bragg convicted of manslaughter due to the death of his baby, a baby he neglected to play EverQuest. Around the same time, websites like EverQuest Widows began to appear. These websites offered support for spouses who thought that they had lost their loved ones, usually their husbands, to the game. Less dramatic, but still deeply impactful, were the publicized stories of players playing the game for hours a day, all at the expense of real-world relationships or occupational success. One survey of over 2,000 players found that the average playtime was 20 hours a week, and 37% of players referred to themselves as addicted. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, national media began to chime in, with some going as far as to refer to EverQuest by one of its given nicknames, Evercrack. As you would expect, Sony, who owned the EverQuest brand at the time, denied that the game was dangerous. However, an increasing amount of complaints did lead to at least one change: a built-in alarm clock that allowed players to set their own limits. Next, one of the genuinely uglier games on this list, Fantasmagoria. Let's start with the basics. Fantasmagoria is a computer game from 1995 developed by the venerable studio Sierra Online. Like Night Trap, the game is an interactive movie, although this game takes advantage of more advanced point-and-click elements. However, while Night Trap was largely built on camp, Fantasmagoria dramatically upped the ante in terms of production values. From conception to execution, it took 8 years for designer Roberta Williams to be able to develop the game. It cost $4.5 million to film, and filming took place in a $1.5 million studio that Sierra built for the game. It used 1,000 backgrounds, a 550-page script, and a 135-person choir that chanted a Neo-Gregorian chant. When finally released, the game was available on 7 discs. In other words, this game wasn't messing around. Phantasmagoria is a horror game. The protagonist buys a haunted mansion and eventually learns that the haunter of said mansion, the evil magician Carno, violently murdered all 5 of his wives. It's a lot. The violence, which was noted by game developers and reviewers, was much more explicit and realistic than anything seen in games before. There's heads being split wide open like watermelons, strangulations, players on fire, and all complete with some really graphical detail that, even 30 years later, is pretty gory. Even more graphic is the sexual violence. While not entirely new to the computer game world, see the always charming Custer's Revenge as an example, the game actually features a rape scene, and while it's not quite at the level of pornography, it's really not great. To be fair, Sierra Online, though clearly banking on controversy, was honest about the game. Its marketing and sales material stressed that the game was not meant for kids. And the game came with a password system that allowed players to tone down the graphical content. Of course, that didn't stop widespread condemnation. Many stores, including CompUSA, straight up didn't sell it. Reviewers noted the explicit violence in the game and connected it to a rise in mass shootings, which, let's be real, was probably a stretch. Politicians also criticized the game, bringing it up at congressional hearings. Multiple countries, including Australia, denied it a rating, meaning that the game couldn't even be sold in some countries. It got so bad that the Kentucky Teachers Retirement System was criticized for owning stock in Sendent, the company which owned Sierra Online. Yeah. Of course, the game, as you would expect, was a huge hit. In its first weekend, it raked in $12 million and sold 300,000 units, eventually becoming the best-selling computer game in the world and potentially reaching that marker faster than any other game at the time. It would sell over 1 million copies and stay on the best-selling charts for as long as a year after it first hit the market. And finally, the GOAT of controversial 90s games, the game that caused countless kids to lie about the blood mode and the way to disable it to their parents. Yep, that was me, 1992's Mortal Kombat. Mortal Kombat, of course, was not the first fighting game. Indeed, at first, it wasn't even the most popular, with Street Fighter II: The World Warrior, released in 1991, serving as a less bloody and deeply thrilling alternative. However, Mortal Kombat did take things to the next level. The controversies that the game faced were multifaceted. Street Fighter didn't kick up a ton of dirt in the broader cultural wars, but the art style was more cartoonish. More importantly, there really wasn't any blood. Was, of course, not the case for Mortal Kombat, which used digitized graphics to display its blood and gore, and there was a lot of that. The regular fighting was bad enough, with blood spurting from players when they were punched. However, it was the fatalities that engendered the most controversy. They involved hearts getting ripped out, heads getting punched off, players being burned to death, all that jazz. Of course, while that's relatively tame by today's standards, it was a big deal in '92. One of the things that made this fight even more interesting was that it actually pitted the consoles against each other. Nintendo refused to allow such a bloody, gory game on their system, requiring that developers actually tone down the violence. Sega, however, had no such requirements, giving the company a leg up on Nintendo in the continued console wars of the 1990s. The game featured prominently in the 1993 congressional hearings, earning widespread condemnation by elected officials and the experts who testified at the hearings. Those hearings actually meant that Mortal Kombat was canceled in some countries, like Spain, where there were extensive fears of the game causing even more controversy. Besides politicians, parent groups, and religious leaders also condemned the game, believing it would lead to violence and a widespread decay of morals in America. For whatever it's worth, the fears weren't completely unfounded, and there is ample evidence of kids being hurt or killed while imitating Mortal Kombat. Of course, as you probably expect by now, the controversy helped sales. Mortal Kombat would sell north of 83 million copies and start sequels that last to this day. And of course, the game got even more bloody. As a final nod to the controversies, Mortal Kombat 2, released in 1993, gives two alternatives to fatalities: friendship moves, which are just so cute, and babalities, in which you turn your opponents into babies. I know that this list isn't even close to all-encompassing, so I turn to you, dear reader. What games did I miss? What controversies would you have liked to see highlighted? Let me know in the comments below, and as always, if you enjoyed this video, and I hope you did, please leave a comment, like the video, subscribe to the channel, or click on the next video that the almighty YouTube algorithm has served up for you. Thank you so much for watching, my friends. Have a wonderful day out there, and I hope you enjoyed watching this video as much as I like making it. Take care, everybody.